Good day. Sometimes the fog of war can produce rather surprising outcomes, and I had a good example of this morning when I got up and read a whole cluster of reports that the Ukrainian military had crossed over to the east bank of the Dnieper River and captured the village or small town of Aliorsky on the east bank of the Dnieper. And reports about this continued for several hours. Reuters, for example, published a report in Britain in which they talked about the Russians having abandoned Aliorsky, and the well-known Ukrainian journalist and actually rather good journalist and blogger Aliorsky also ran with this story for some time. And eventually, perhaps inevitably, a report appeared on the Russian news agency TASS from quoting the Russian authorities in Kherson region, and they categorically denied the story that Aliorsky had indeed been captured by the Ukrainians or that the Ukrainians had established any sort of presence there. Briefly, the statement read that this is from the press service of the Russian-backed government of Kherson region, which is now, as I've said previously, located in the town of Genishek. The Russian-backed government said the Ukrainian side's statements are false. The populated locality is being shelled, but there weren't, aren't, and won't be any Ukrainian troops. This is a fake news item which the Ukrainian side is using in an attempt to confuse people. Well, as to the last point, that may be true, or it could be, and this I'm now taking from the Reuters report. The Reuters report spoke of an enthusiastic pro-Ukrainian blogger in Aliorsky, zooming down the main road of Aliorsky and finding that there was no sign of any Russian checkpoints and of supposedly all of the Russian barracks and pillboxes and all of those things having been evacuated. And it could be that this information somehow worked its way through and people added to it as they do, and eventually this evolved into a story about Aliorsky having been either captured or occupied or entered by the Ukrainian military in some shape or form. I would say there's a fundamental difference between the Russians having evacuated some positions in Aliorsky and Ukraine actually occupying Aliorsky. There might be good reasons why the Russians want to pull back some of their positions away from the banks of the Dnieper, given that the Ukrainians are now on the West Bank. Ukraine would be in a position presumably to shell some of these positions. So it's entirely possible, entirely likely, that the Russians have relocated some of their troops in this area to more defensible positions, but it doesn't mean that they've abandoned Aliorsky to the Ukrainians, or that the Ukrainians have tried to occupy Aliorsky, or that the Ukrainians have any plan to occupy Aliorsky at the present moment in time. In fact, there is a report, which I cannot confirm, but which comes from Ukrainian sources, that General Zaluzhny and the Ukrainian General Staff have advised categorically against any attempt to try to cross over to the East Bank in the face of the very powerful Russian forces now located on the East Bank. They think that that would be a doomed venture, and I'm sure that that is correct. So there we are. Now, by the way, on the topic of the Russians having perhaps relocated some of their forces on the East Bank. It's quite an interesting intelligence update for once from the British about the fact that the Russians have now established their joint headquarters in Genishek on the Sea of Azov. Now, this is apparently this town now apparently on the Sea of Azov in Kherson region contains both the local Russian military headquarters as well as the civilian government of Kherson region. And the British intelligence update says that this is a well thought out location. It's outside shelling range. The Ukrainian artillery can't reach it, and so that the Russians can administer Kherson region, administer their troops in eastern Kherson region without interference from Ukrainian artillery. And at the same time, it is well positioned to control movement of supplies from Crimea and to coordinate any defences both in Kherson region and in Zaporozhye region. Now, I ought to quickly say that though I completely discounted these stories about the Ukrainians having crossed over the Dnieper when I first read them this morning, they were clearly fog of war stuff. I did get quite a lot of emails about it from various people, which shows how nervous people are or excited people are, depending on which side they're on, after the Russian withdrawal from the West Bank. But I would say that even though it's inconceivable that the Ukrainians would launch such an attack now, over the next couple of days, I mean, doing so, well, how would they do it? I mean, do they have the ships, the pontoon craft? Do they have the pontoon bridges? It would be a very complex operation, and it would require a lot of preparation. But having said that, it's possible that at some point the Ukrainians will launch some kind of amphibious landing, or try to launch some kind of amphibious landing on the east bank of the Dnieper. And as a number of commentators have pointed out, the United States has recently donated to Ukraine 40 armoured boats, which look like they're intended to facilitate precisely that kind of a landing. But the general consensus appears to be, and I'm not in any position to challenge it, that if there is going to be such a landing, it's more likely to be connected to an attack, connected to an attempt to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, where the Ukrainians have launched repeated amphibious landings in its vicinity, all of which have been repelled, by the way, up to now, and perhaps as part of the larger Ukrainian plan, which everybody's talking about, for an offensive from Zaporozhye towards the Sea of Azov. In other words, it will be something that will take place further north from Kherson region, from this area of Kherson region, from Aliorsky. It will be an attempted operation in and around Zaporozhye itself. And the Russians have said that they are well aware of these plans, that they're building trenches and fortifications. This was said by Vladimir Rogov, who is the deputy governor of Zaporozhye region, fulfilling the same role that his late colleague Kirill Stremusov used to fill in Kherson region. Rogov is giving us information that fortifications and fortified lines are being built in preparation for such a Ukrainian offensive, if it ever comes. And in my program yesterday, I discussed the heavy concentrations of Russian troops that are now in this area and the difficulties that will pose for the Ukrainians if they do launch an offensive. Anyway, in this area. Anyway, all of that is happening whilst continuing fighting goes on in Donbass, and the Russians, by the way, have now provided a summary of the fighting in Pavlovka. Now, if you go back a few days, about a week, there were lots of reports about the Russians having suffered very heavy casualties in the Battle of Pavlovka. This is this village, fortified village, near the fortified town of Ugleda, which is in southern Donetsk region. There were reports that the Russians had had up to 300 casualties in the fighting there. The Russian Defense Ministry said this was an exaggeration. There were further reports which took place over the next couple of days which reduced the number, suggested that perhaps 10 to 20 Russian troops might have been killed in the fighting, and perhaps 100, or perhaps somewhat more than that, Russian soldiers might have been wounded in the fighting. Russian soldiers from a Marine brigade, a naval infantry brigade, which played the largest part in the fighting in Pavlovka. Well, the Russian Defense Ministry has now said that 1,400 Ukrainian troops were destroyed in Pavlovka. Again, I am assuming that this means killed, which seems an astonishingly high number, but that's what the Russians are claiming. I have no way of independently verifying these claims, but it does certainly seem as if Pavlovka was an intense and hard-fought battle, which the Russians won in the sense that they've now captured the place, though it's quite likely that the Ukrainians will make some attempt to recapture it before long. And whatever, the Russians certainly did lose some troops capturing Pavlovka, but the Russians claim that the Ukrainians lost much more. Now, there's been fighting in other places. I'm not going to go into the details of this at the moment. Most of it seems to be a case of Ukraine launching attacks in northern Donbass, those attacks being repelled. And by the way, of Ukraine launching some attacks also in Zaporozhye region, and those attacks also being repelled. There was a rather troubling claim made by the Russians, a Russian official. I think it was Vladimir Rogov again, and I would say that overall I've tended to find Rogov a fairly reliable source. But anyway, like I did Stremusov, by the way, I'm not saying that they were either Stremusov before or Rogov now tell us the whole truth about the battle. They certainly don't. But overall, I find that when they do say something, it tends to be true. Anyway, I pass this on. A Russian official, probably Rogov, said that when after battles, there's usually between the two sides a period of quiet. Doesn't seem as if these periods of quiet are necessarily agreed between the parties, but there seems to be a kind of tacit understanding that there should be an hour or two to recover the wounded and the bodies of the dead, except that the Ukrainians have not been collecting their dead, who remain scattered across the fields. And I have to say, this corresponds with a lot of the photographic evidence that I've seen. I remember way back in March, in fighting, which I believe was in Kherson region, I saw pictures afterwards of huge numbers, large numbers of Ukrainian bodies and remains of soldiers reaching to the horizon. And I remember being surprised that no attempt was being made to collect these bodies. And ever since then, every so often, I've seen pictures, really very distressing, grisly pictures of Ukrainian soldiers, dead bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. And again, I've been surprised that these soldiers have been left out in the open in that sort of way. Anyway, Rogov says that there's two reasons for this. I just pass this on. I'm not saying this is true, by the way, but I pass this on. Rogov says that there's two reasons. Firstly, it's a way for Ukraine to deny its casualty numbers. If there are no bodies, then Ukraine, bodies buried, then Ukraine can say that these troops have either been wounded or deserted, or that they've been lost or something like that, or missing in action. And that means that they don't have to, the commanders don't have to report back that these soldiers are dead. And that, of course, partly serves a propaganda purpose, but it also supposedly, according to this Russian official, serves a more mercenary purpose as well, because it means that the commander of the unit to which these soldiers belong will continue to receive salaries for these soldiers for a further 3 months. And the implication is that the officers pocket those salaries. Now, I have to say, I find that disturbing. I do remember that things like that did happen during the Vietnam War, and of course they happened on a much bigger scale in the Afghan War. I would say that the Ukrainian army seems to certainly be capable of fighting aggressively in various situations, and I wonder whether officers who are as corrupt as this story suggests would be able to command the loyalty of their soldiers in that way. But anyway, I pass it on. It's one of those other grisly things one hears about this really, frankly, appalling war. So, fighting going on across the front lines, but no Ukrainian capture of Aliorsky. What there has been today, and it's ongoing as I'm making this program, and I can't give you an assessment of it until I get a clearer picture, is another massive Russian missile strike all across Ukraine. It seems that large numbers of Russian missiles have been launched, including by Tupolev 95 bombers operating in Russia, but it seems that the Black Fleet has also been, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has also been involved in launching missiles, that there have been multiple missile strikes across Ukraine. I can't tell you what they all mean or what their purpose is, but certainly it is a major another one of those days when the Russians have been hitting Ukraine with very large numbers of missiles launched from deep within Russia and from the Black Sea. And I'm guessing, by the way, that is the biggest single event, military event, that's actually happened today. Overall, it seems to me that we are in the quiet before the storm. Zelensky has made a speech to the G20 in which he's again spoken about his desire to end the war now, which contradicts, of course, what he was saying just a few days ago. Doesn't seem so far that he's made any concrete proposals for how the negotiations are to restart. He's not suggested, for example, so far, an actual meeting of officials between Russia and Ukraine anywhere. But anyway, that's the speech Zelensky made, but he also said that Ukraine will continue fighting, continue its offensives through the winter. And whilst I'm on the subject of Ukraine's diplomatic initiatives, well, the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Zaluzhny, has apparently also indicated that Ukraine, for the moment, at least the Ukrainian military, wants to continue fighting. It's not interested in negotiations in any shape or form. At least that seemed to be the tone of the message that he was putting out. So anyway, that's where we are. We are, in terms of the military situation, in this lull before the storm. And I've discussed previously in previous videos that I think the biggest event, the cumulative event that's happening, is the Russian military build-up. And Ukraine will no doubt try, even in difficult weather conditions, to regain some sort of ground. Maybe they will launch this attack in Zaporozhye. We'll see whether that succeeds. But anyway, they're presumably trying to get a blow in first before the effects of this Russian mobilization, not just of men, but of resources as well, begins to have an effect. Now, this is perhaps a good point to allude to something that's was said way back, I think in April and May, by Scott Ritter. And a lot of people have been alluding to this and have been saying that Scott Ritter's been vindicated. And the point that Scott Ritter was making back in April and May was that Putin needed to speed up the military operation in Ukraine because the United States was pouring arms and weapon systems into Ukraine, and unless the Russians cranked up their game, they would find themselves at a disadvantage. And I don't think there's any doubt at all that Scott Ritter overall has been proved to have been correct. I am going to make, however, one observation. My own view is that it was not Western weapons going into Ukraine that changed the situation. I think, and I've seen other military commentators, including American military commentators, by the way, make the same point, that what really has changed the situation is that the Ukrainians used the time from March onwards to carry out multiple mobilizations. In other words, they mobilized large numbers of men and enlisted them into their army, so that by late August, as the Russian forces were reducing in number because soldiers' contracts were running out, by late August, Ukraine had a very, very significant manpower advantage on all fronts. That manpower advantage is diminishing, as, by the way, is the flow of military material to Ukraine from the West. So, eventually, Putin did understand the effect of his delay in his failure to announce the mobilization that took place, his failure to order a mobilization in, well, apparently the military asked for it in June. But he eventually did it in September. But gradually, as I said, the military picture is now starting to change as the Russians are mobilizing. Ukrainians are still trying to mobilize, but I've read on a Russian Telegram channel, it must be said, a report from a German officer who says that Ukraine has now mobilized all the best recruits, the younger men. It's now reduced to mobilizing the people that it's mobilizing. The 100,000 that it's mobilizing to replenish its existing losses are now older men over 45. And of course, the Russian mobilization is only a small part of the number of troops that Russia could mobilize over time. So there we go. We have a situation where it is this Russian mobilization, which I suspect is the event that's going to ultimately decide the course of the battle. And we'll see what the Russians are able to do with these forces once they've fully mobilized. And as I said, December, some say even January, is presumably the time when the Russians will have all their pieces in place. We'll see what they do at that point. Meanwhile, there's been the ongoing diplomacy. Now, there was a meeting, as I discussed yesterday, in Ankara between the CIA chief, William Burns, and the his Russian opposite number, Naryshkin, in Ankara. And as far as I can see, nothing of substance was agreed. If we are to believe the United States, the entire purpose of the meeting was for Burns to warn Naryshkin against Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, something that the Russians have always said that they are not prepared to do, and to discuss exchanges of prisoners. Now, these are prisoners that the Russians, American prisoners that the Russians hold, and Russian prisoners that the Americans hold. It's unrelated to the war in Ukraine. Well, I think the best comment on that American explanation of the meeting comes from John Helmer, who has tweeted that CIA Burns called SVR Naryshkin to meet in Ankara today to repeat what's been said weeks ago about prisoners, nuclears, and Zelensky. Naryshkin told Burns it's snowing in Kiev. In other words, if I get Helmer's sardonic comment correctly, Helmer doesn't believe that, and nor do I. I am sure that they discussed Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine. And it was not the only place, of course, where Ukraine was discussed. There have been discussions in the G20 summit in Bali. Now, in the run-up to the G20 summit meeting, there were all sorts of reports that the Western powers were intending to boycott completely the Russian delegation. Well, if we are to believe Lavrov, this didn't actually happen. Lavrov claims that he had brief meetings with both Scholz, Chancellor Scholz of Germany, and Emmanuel Macron. And it does look as if some discussions for some kind of decision, some kind of diplomatic initiative with respect to Ukraine took place there, but, I can't confirm that. But anyway, the fact is that there were some kind of contacts of some kind by the French and by the Germans. And, of course, Lavrov had a very friendly and very long meeting with the Chinese foreign minister. And he's been busy meeting all sorts of other people as well. There was a strange story that he had suffered from some kind of illness, which was spread by the British news agency Reuters. That turned out to be entirely untrue. And in fact, the Chinese and Russian foreign ministers joked about it. Anyway, it seems as if the G20 meeting has gone by somewhat more quietly than anticipated. Firstly, Lavrov did not walk out of Zelensky's virtual address to the summit meeting participants, and nor did the Western delegations walk out of the hall when Lavrov spoke, which is interesting. even though actually he didn't say anything that seemed to me particularly new. There is a lot of argument about the final communique and much doubt whether there would be one. Well, it seems that after a lot of diplomatic activity by the Indonesians and by the Indians, there will be a final communique which everybody is in agreement with. And it will be one which apparently says that the era of war is ending. Now, that doesn't condemn Russia as such. And it's an echo of what was said in a meeting in Samarkand between Putin and Modi, which was then seized upon by the Western media. Now, if you reel back in time to the Samarkand meeting in September, Putin met with Xi Jinping of China, and he met with Narendra Modi of India. Over the course of the Russian readout of the meeting with Xi Jinping, Putin mentioned the fact that the Chinese had concerns about the situation in Ukraine, about what was going on in Ukraine. And Putin said that he appreciated that the Russians appreciated Chinese understanding of Russia's position. Well, the Western powers, the Western media seized on that one-word concern in the Russian readout as implying that there was a rift between China and Russia over Ukraine. Well, we've seen no evidence of that since. I said at the time that that didn't look to me to be the case at all. And sure enough, it's turned out that that was not, that word concern was taken out of context, as I said it was at the time, and that people were reading into it far more than was intended. Obviously, the Chinese are concerned about Ukraine. The Russians have never disputed that. They've always acknowledged this. There have always been discussions between the Chinese and the Russians about Ukraine. And there was no evidence of any sort of rift between the Chinese and the Russians in Samarkand. And the same applied to words that appeared on the Indian readout of the meeting between Modi and Putin in Samarkand. Now, again, I discussed this in a video that I did at the time, but the readout, the Indian readout, had Modi talking about relations with Russia in very lavish terms and saying how important those relations were for him personally and for India. But he did at one point say that the era of war was ending. And again, the Western media seized on that as a rebuke by Modi of Putin. But again, that didn't look at the entire context of the Indian readout, which on the contrary spoke about Indian-Russian relations in very favourable terms. And what we've seen since then is that the Indians and the Russians have moved forward with a whole range of economic agreements. And of course, India has now stepped up its imports of oil from Russia, undermining Janet Yellen's oil price cap idea. So it looks as if the comment by Modi to Putin about the era of war ending was not intended to be directed specifically at Russia. It was a general observation. Now, it's a general observation which includes obviously Russia. It includes Ukraine. which, by the way, Modi also spoke about favourably in that conversation with Putin, at least according to the Indian readout. It also includes the West, and it could include other countries. It could include Pakistan. It could include all sorts of places. What Modi was saying, also it seems to me what the Indians were trying to say, is that this period of time when great powers use war in order to achieve their geopolitical objectives, that period is ending. And if there is any country that might be most strongly directed towards, I would argue that it's not Russia, which is defending what it says are its vital red lines in Ukraine. Rather, it is the United States, which has been using its armed forces, its war capabilities over the last 30 or so years, and still today, in order to conduct wars in various places to achieve its geopolitical objectives. So I don't want to push this too far. I don't think Modi was alluding in that readout to the United States specifically. But it's quite likely that he had the United States and its regime change wars, at least in part, in mind. And he was trying to say that from now on, we need to move forward to a system based on international law, which is what the Russians and the Chinese support, a system based on international law in which the great powers, instead of trying to square off against each other and trying to manipulate and bully smaller countries, that they try instead to try and negotiate their differences peacefully. And that is the concept that Modi has, with the help of the Indonesians, has apparently managed to get into this communique, the G20 communique. It hasn't yet been published, at least I haven't yet seen a full copy, so we'll see what it says. But it seems to me that from an attempt by the West to try to get some kind of condemnation of Russia, they've been maneuvered, perhaps not fully understanding the extent to which this has been done. But anyway, they've been maneuvered into a position where they've instead agreed to a communique which agrees with this Indian formulation that the era of war is over or coming to an end, which works, it seems to me, against the objectives, the intentions, the ultimate methods, principally of the neocons in Washington. Anyway, that's all I will say. If you want a better sense of what international opinion really thinks about this whole conflict, then perhaps it's worthwhile going back to the United Nations. There was a meeting of the General Assembly the other day at which the Western powers sponsored a resolution in which they tried to get a decision that authorized the payment of reparations by Russia to Ukraine. Now, the Russians correctly said that a United Nations General Assembly does not have the authority to order reparations in that kind of a way. Resolutions of the General Assembly are generally non-binding anyway, and they were absolutely right about this. The Russians have also said that this particular resolution was clearly intended to provide some kind of legal cover, even though it actually doesn't do that, but at least pretended legal cover to the seizure of Russian assets that the European Union and the United States currently have in mind. But anyway, regardless of that, the resolution was put to the vote. And it was very interesting to see who voted for it and who abstained and who did not vote at all, or at least what the numbers were. So, supporting the resolution, 94 states. Opposing it, voting against it, 14 states, including, by the way, China. Abstaining, 73, including India and Brazil. Not voting at all, 11. So, overall, only a minority of states, 94, voted to support this resolution. Now, that strongly suggests that there isn't huge enthusiasm, to put it mildly, for the American drive to sort of isolate Russia. The Russians were not isolated either at the G20, and they're clearly not fully isolated at the level of the General Assembly either. Perhaps because the General Assembly vote didn't go particularly well, it's not been widely reported in the West, at least not in Britain, to any extent that I can see. Anyway, there's been something else, because even as there's all this talk of negotiations, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, who is the person who's been talking to Jake Sullivan over those telephone calls, he's now issued an extremely strong statement. He says that the objective of the United States is to isolate and break up Russia, that this is what this conflict in Ukraine is all about, and that clearly the United States remains implacable. Now, Patrushev is an important official, and undoubtedly what he says mirrors what many people in the Russian political hierarchy feel. But I have to say that these very strong comments, which he's reported to have made, do not seem to me to be consistent at all with any expectation from the Russian side that this conflict in Ukraine is going to end in negotiations at any point soon. And Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has also said separately that the Ukrainians, far from wanting negotiations, are continuing to sabotage them by setting impossible conditions. Well, we will see what happens. We will see whether the Ukrainians mollify their position, perhaps under pressure from the West, from the United States, and from its European allies, whether there's any change in the military situation. I think if the military situation shifts back in Russia's favor over the next few weeks and months, then I think that will be deeply demoralizing in Ukraine. It will become clear that their counteroffensives have actually achieved very little. If we also see what the pressures are in the West as well. I've read another long report, by the way, which also casts doubt now on whether Europe does indeed have enough gas to get through the winter intact. It suggests that without gas being pumped by Gazprom from Russia through the pipelines, the reserves, these underground gas reserves, which Gazprom itself built in Europe, that they're going to start to run down fairly fast as the weather continues to grow colder. Well, we'll see. And in addition, I read further reports that the Russians are continuing very successfully to redirect their oil flows eastwards to India, to China, to Turkey, to all sorts of other partners, economic partners that they have in the Far East. So, at the moment, we are, if you like, still very much in the quiet before the storm. There's been various diplomatic moves. Maybe the West was trying to test the Russian position. Maybe they were saying to themselves, another possibility amongst the many I floated. Maybe they were saying to themselves, well, after the pullbacks, the setbacks from Kharkiv and Kherson, maybe the Russians are preparing to bend a little. Maybe they're prepared to make concessions. And maybe that was what Sullivan was trying to explore when he called Patrushev and Ushakov, and what Burns was also trying to explore when he met Narishkin in Ankara. If so, then Peskov's comments, Patrushev's comments, seem to make it very clear that the Russians haven't altered their position by 1 inch. Anyway, we'll see whether the Western powers are interested in looking for further moves, either from the Ukrainians or from the Russians. We'll see what the two sides do militarily. And in the meantime, in my next program, I will, of course, catch up with this very heavy Russian missile offensive on Ukraine, which has been taking place over the course of today. It seems to have been taking place all across Ukraine. Settlements and cities seem to have been attacked in numerous places. And tomorrow I'll fill you up a bit. I'll give you my overall assessment of all of that. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Remember, you can get all our videos on Locals, on Rumble, on BitChute, on ODYSEE, on Telegram, and of course on Rockfin. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying all the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and please check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.